October 14, 1943. Nearly 3,000 American airmen climbed into 291 B-17 flying fortresses, preparing for what would become one of the deadliest missions in aviation history. Their destination, Schweinfurt, Germany, home to the Reich's critical ball-bearing factories. This wasn't their first attempt. 2 months prior, the 8th Air Force had sent bombers to this same target. That mission had been catastrophic. 36 bombers obliterated, hundreds of men dead or imprisoned. The survivors returned with haunting accounts of relentless fighter attacks, some crews completely depleted of ammunition before ever reaching their objective. They described German fighters lining up in the distance, methodically taking turns to strafe the American formations. Schweinfurt manufactured ball bearings, components essential to virtually every piece of German military hardware. Tanks required them. Aircraft depended on them. Submarines couldn't function without them. American strategists were convinced that eliminating these factories would cripple the Nazi war machine. The target justified any sacrifice. Now they were returning. Every crew member understood what awaited them. They'd witnessed the vacant bunks in their quarters following the first raid. They'd stood at memorial services for comrades who'd been laughing over breakfast and dead by sunset. They comprehended the odds perfectly, yet they climbed aboard their bombers anyway. At 25,000 feet, the external temperature plummeted to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the aircraft, conditions were barely better. The B-17 lacked pressurization and heating systems. The thin aluminum fuselage conducted cold directly into crew compartments like a massive refrigerator. Frost crystallized on window interiors. Exhaled breath froze instantly on oxygen masks. Metal surfaces became so frigid that bare skin contact meant immediate frostbite. The waist gunners suffered worst of all. They stood at open windows on both sides of the aircraft, operating .50 caliber machine guns that forced them to lean into a 200-mile-per-hour Arctic blast. Wind chill at those velocities and temperatures created conditions beyond human endurance. Even with electrically heated suits and multiple insulation layers, these men battled against an environment that would freeze exposed flesh in under 60 seconds. Every airman wore an electrically heated flight suit, a one-piece coverall with heating wires integrated throughout the fabric. These suits connected to the aircraft's electrical system and were designed to keep crews alive at extreme altitudes. Designed to. But the suits contained a fatal flaw that testing had never revealed. And that morning over Europe, dozens of those suits were failing. Wires were snapping inside the fabric. Heating circuits were dying. Men who'd been comfortable moments earlier suddenly found themselves exposed to lethal cold with no protection and no possibility of repair. German fighters and anti-aircraft fire would devastate the formation that day. 60 bombers destroyed, over 100 others damaged, many beyond repair. More than 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. The mission would be remembered as Black Thursday, among the darkest moments in American military aviation. But what the survivors didn't yet realize, what Army Air Forces leadership was only beginning to comprehend, was that the cold itself was claiming more victims than German weapons. Not as spectacularly, not as visibly, but just as permanently. During the 14 months ending December 1943, 1,634 men were removed from flying duty due to cold injuries sustained during operations. In that same period, 1,272 men were removed because of wounds from enemy action. The cold was killing more American airmen than the Luftwaffe. This is the account of how America attempted to defeat German fighters at high altitude and inadvertently froze its own pilots to death. It's a story of bureaucratic failure and individual heroism, of engineers who never experienced combat designing equipment for men who would die using it, of a surgeon who'd served in World War I trenches and refused to accept that good men should continue dying from preventable causes. It's the story of how lessons learned in frozen agony over Germany would reshape military aviation for decades to come. The problem originated with a fundamental miscalculation about aerial combat over Europe. When Boeing designed the B-17 Flying Fortress in the mid-1930s, engineers in sunny California envisioned a strategic weapon that would operate higher than enemy fighters could effectively intercept. The bomber's service ceiling exceeded 30,000 feet. At that altitude, anti-aircraft guns lost accuracy because shelf flight time allowed bombers to maneuver unpredictably. Fighter planes struggled to climb high enough, and those that did found their engines oxygen-starved, their controls sluggish in the thin atmosphere. The high-altitude doctrine made tactical sense. Flying above the threat meant surviving to bomb another day. American war planners constructed their entire strategy around this concept. Formations of heavy bombers would fly in tight defensive boxes, their overlapping machine gun fire creating an impenetrable wall of lead. They would bomb from above the worst defenses and return home largely unscathed. The theory was elegant. Reality was catastrophic. The designers had never experienced what their crews would endure. They'd calculated the bomber's performance at altitude, but hadn't fully considered what altitude would do to the men inside. At 30,000 feet, air temperature drops to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. At 25,000 feet, where most combat occurred, temperatures averaged minus 40 to minus 50. Human flesh exposed to that cold freezes in under 60 seconds. Bare metal becomes so cold that contact means instant frostbite. Breath freezes before leaving the oxygen mask. The B-17 carried a crew of 10 men distributed throughout an unheated, unpressurized fuselage. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit forward, their positions relatively protected but still exposed to bitter cold. The bombardier and navigator occupied the nose compartment below them, surrounded by plexiglass that offered spectacular visibility but virtually no insulation. The flight engineer manned the top turret behind the cockpit. The radio operator sat at his station amidships. 2 waist gunners stood at open windows on either side of the fuselage. The ball turret gunner crouched in a spherical turret beneath the aircraft. The tail gunner sat isolated in a cramped compartment at the extreme rear. Every position was cold. Some were lethally cold. The waist gun positions were exposed to a 200-mile-per-hour slipstream through open windows. The original design provided no covering for these openings because gunners needed maximum freedom to track attacking fighters. When enemy aircraft approached on beam attacks, waist gunners leaned into that Arctic blast, pivoting their heavy weapons to follow targets closing at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. No amount of clothing could protect against that exposure. Wind chill calculations at 200 miles per hour in minus 50-degree air produce effective temperatures far beyond anything humans can survive for extended periods. Even brief exposure meant frostbite. Extended exposure meant permanent injury. The ball turret was worse in a different way. Manufactured by Sperry Corporation, it was an engineering marvel that had become an exposure nightmare. The spherical turret was roughly 4 feet in diameter, just large enough to contain a man in fetal position along with 2.50 caliber machine guns, ammunition feeds, a reflector sight, and mechanical systems allowing the turret to rotate in any direction. There was no room for a parachute inside the turret. No room for extra clothing. Barely room for the gunner. Only the smallest crew members were assigned to this position. Regulations generally limited ball turret gunners to men under 5 feet 6 inches tall and 150 pounds in weight. The turret was surrounded by plexiglass and aluminum offering no insulation whatsoever. Cold radiated through every surface. The gunner sat with knees drawn to his chest, hands on control handles that became so cold they could freeze through gloves. His feet rested on pedals that became blocks of ice. His back pressed against the turret shell, which conducted cold directly into his body. If something went wrong with his heating equipment, the ball turret gunner had no options. He couldn't easily leave his position because the turret had to be rotated to a specific orientation for him to climb out, and that rotation required electrical power. If battle damage cut the power, or if the turret mechanism jammed, the gunner was trapped. And if his heating suit failed while trapped, he would freeze. Most ball turret gunners whose suits failed chose to remain in position. They understood that leaving would endanger the aircraft and crew. German fighters had learned to attack from below because it was a vulnerable angle. A fighter approaching from underneath could rake the bomber with fire before the top turret or waist guns could respond. The ball turret gunner was often the only defense against these attacks. Abandoning the turret meant abandoning his crewmates to that threat. So they stayed. They kept their hands on the control handles, scanning the sky below for enemy fighters even as the cold crept through their bodies. The temperature in the turret dropped steadily as the aircraft climbed. At 22,000 feet, it was minus 30 degrees. At 25,000 feet, minus 40 degrees. The cold radiated through the plexiglass dome, through the aluminum structure, through the thin leather of their flight gloves. Their fingers went numb first, then their hands, then their forearms. The numbness crept up their arms like rising water, steady and inexorable. But they kept their hands on the controls. They kept watching for fighters. They kept doing their jobs until the aircraft landed and someone came to help them out of the turret. Flight surgeons who treated these men after missions sometimes had to cut the gloves off their hands with surgical scissors because frozen fingers couldn't flex to remove them. The flesh underneath was white and hard, frozen solid. Many lost fingers. Some lost entire hands. All of them had done their duty until the very end. The tail gunner sat in complete isolation from the rest of the crew, separated by the length of the fuselage and surrounded by cold flowing around the tail surfaces into his compartment. He could communicate only by interphone. If his oxygen system failed or his heating suit died, no one could reach him to help. He would simply freeze alone while his crewmates continued the mission unaware of his situation until they landed and found him. The first bombers of the 8th Air Force arrived in England during summer 1942, ready to prove that daylight precision bombing could win the war. What they discovered instead was that their own aircraft were killing crews before the Germans had a chance. Colonel Malcolm Grow had seen combat before, and he understood what it did to men and organizations. As a young surgeon in 1915, he traveled to Tsarist Russia and volunteered with the Russian army on the Eastern Front. For 2 years, he'd operated on wounded soldiers while German artillery shells exploded around his field hospital. He'd worked in conditions that would have seemed impossible to American medical professionals of the era, improvising surgical techniques and treatment protocols under fire. The Russians recognized his courage and skill. He earned the Order of St. George for gallantry under fire, one of the highest military decorations Imperial Russia could bestow on a foreign officer. He also received the Order of St. Stanislaus for his surgical work. His 1918 memoir, Surgeon Grow, An American in Russian Fighting, documented these extraordinary experiences and established him as one of the few American military medical officers with extensive frontline combat experience. In 1917, after the Russian Revolution made his position untenable, Grow returned to the United States and joined the Army. He spent the interwar years building expertise in a field that barely existed when he'd left for Russia, aviation medicine. He earned his aviation medicine certificate in 1928, helped establish the Aero Medical Laboratory at Wright-Patterson in Ohio. By the time the United States entered World War II, Grow was one of the most experienced aviation medicine specialists in the military, combining practical combat experience with deep knowledge of the unique physiological challenges of flight. General Carl Spaatz was building the 8th Air Force in England and needed a surgeon who understood both combat and aviation, someone who could handle mass casualties, someone who knew how to operate under wartime conditions, someone who could improvise solutions when standard procedures failed. Malcolm Grow was the obvious choice. Grow arrived in England in 1942 and immediately began studying the unique medical challenges of high-altitude bombing operations. The problems were unlike anything American medicine had faced before. Ground combat produced wounds from bullets and shell fragments, injuries that medical professionals understood and knew how to treat. But high-altitude bombing produced something different. It produced cold injuries. The first frostbite cases came back from early missions over occupied France. Waist gunners with blackened fingers. Tail gunners whose ears had turned white and hard and numb. Ball turret operators who couldn't feel their feet when they climbed out of their turrets after landing. Men who hadn't been touched by enemy fire, but were just as badly injured as if they had been. The injuries were severe enough to ground experienced crews, men the 8th Air Force desperately needed. Training a bomber crew took months. Combat experience took even longer to acquire. A pilot might have hundreds of hours of flight time, but combat flying was different from training. A gunner might have practiced on ranges, but shooting at towed targets was nothing like shooting at fighters that were shooting back. Every man lost to frostbite was a gap in capability that couldn't easily be filled. Gross studied the casualty reports with growing alarm. The pattern was unmistakable. Men were getting frostbite despite wearing the protective gear the Army had issued them. They were following procedures. They were using their equipment correctly. And they were still freezing. The equipment was supposed to work. The specifications said it would protect against high-altitude cold. The manufacturers had tested it. The procurement officers had approved it. But the specifications were wrong. The electrically heated flight suit was supposed to be the solution to high-altitude cold. The concept dated back to 1918, when the Army Air Corps first experimented with electric heating for aviators flying open cockpit biplanes. Development continued through the 1920s and 30s, driven by the increasing altitude capabilities of new aircraft. By 1941, the standard heated suit was the F-1, manufactured exclusively by General Electric and standardized on April 4th of that year. The F-1 was a one-piece coverall made of felted woven wool with heated wires sewn throughout the fabric in a blanket-style pattern. The suit plugged into the aircraft's 24-volt electrical system through a 2-pin connector. Power flowed through the wires, generating heat through electrical resistance. The concept was identical to an electric blanket adapted for aviation use. Pilots and crew called it the Blue Bunny because of its distinctive light blue color. When functioning properly, it could keep a man comfortable at -30 degrees. Priority for the suits went to tail and ball gunners who occupied the coldest positions, with waist gunners next in line if sufficient electrical capacity was available. The B-17 was the only bomber using a 24-volt electrical system at the time, so only B-17 crews could use the Blue Bunny suits. The concept was sound. Electrical heating could generate warmth without requiring heavy insulation that would restrict movement. A man wearing a properly functioning heated suit could operate his weapon systems without the bulk of Arctic survival gear. He could track targets smoothly. He could manipulate controls precisely. He could fight effectively even at extreme altitude. The execution was catastrophic. The F-1 suit had a fatal design flaw that testing in the American Southwest hadn't revealed. The heating wires were connected in series, like old-fashioned Christmas lights. Electric current flowed through every wire in sequence, from one end of the circuit to the other. If every connection was intact, the suit worked perfectly. Current flowed smoothly through the entire system, heating every portion of the fabric evenly. But if one wire broke anywhere in the circuit, the entire system failed. No current could flow past a break. The suit went cold completely and instantly, with no warning and no way to restore function. One moment a man was warm. The next moment he was exposed to killing cold with no protection. The wires broke constantly. The felted wool fabric shifted during movement, stressing the wires sewn into it. Gunners twisted and turned to track enemy fighters. They crouched and stretched to clear jammed weapons. They climbed in and out of cramped positions. They moved in all the ways combat required them to move. And every motion stressed the fragile wiring sewn into their suits. The testing in the American Southwest hadn't caught this problem because the testing hadn't replicated combat conditions. Men wearing the suits in test environments moved carefully and deliberately. They didn't twist and dive and scramble the way men did when German fighters were shooting at them. The wires held up to careful movement. They didn't hold up to combat. A man would simply realize at 25,000 feet over enemy territory, with Focke-Wulf 190s making firing passes at his aircraft, that his suit had stopped working. The warmth would disappear. The cold would begin seeping through his flight gear. He had minutes, perhaps 15 or 20 if he was lucky, before frostbite began destroying his hands. And there was nothing he could do about it. He couldn't diagnose the problem. He couldn't fix the break. He couldn't even identify where in the circuit the wire had failed. The Army's investigation, conducted in March 1943, documented the scope of the disaster. Electrically heated garment failures were responsible for approximately 3/4 of frostbite casualties caused by equipment malfunction. The suits were failing faster than they could be replaced, faster than crews could adapt, faster than the supply chain could deliver new equipment. The Blue Bunny was supposed to save lives. Instead, it was creating casualties. Colonel Grow compiled statistics that told a story the Army Air Force's leadership didn't want to hear. In the 14-month period ending December 1943, frostbite was removing more men from flying duty than German fighters and anti-aircraft guns combined. The cold was a more effective weapon than the Luftwaffe. 1/3 of all frostbite casualties required hospitalization. Many of those men wouldn't return to duty for months. Some would never return at all. You cannot regrow amputated fingers. Frostbitten feet that have lost circulation don't heal quickly or completely. Men who had survived German fighters and flak were being permanently disabled by their own equipment. The 8th Air Force was bleeding trained aircrew faster than replacements could be trained and shipped across the Atlantic. The training pipeline couldn't keep pace with losses. Experience was being drained from the squadrons. Every time a veteran gunner lost fingers to the cold, the enemy causing most of the damage wasn't flying fighter aircraft or manning anti-aircraft batteries. The enemy was the temperature at altitude, the failed heating suits, the open windows in the waist gun positions, the inadequate equipment and training that no one had anticipated would become a crisis. Grow presented his findings to commanding officers. The response was a mixture of frustration, denial, and bureaucratic paralysis. The heating suits were supposed to work. The specifications said they would function at high altitude. The manufacturer claimed they'd been thoroughly tested. Procurement officers, who had purchased thousands of these suits, insisted they met all requirements. But specifications meant nothing when wires were breaking inside the suits. Manufacturer claims meant nothing when men were losing fingers. Procurement paperwork meant nothing when the Blue Bunny suits failed mission after mission. Grow pushed harder. He requested resources to study the problem systematically. He asked for authority to develop alternative solutions. He wanted engineering support to redesign the heating systems. He needed manufacturing capacity to produce improved equipment once designs were finalized. The bureaucracy moved slowly. Requisitions sat on desks awaiting signatures. Approval chains stretched across the Atlantic to Washington. Officers who'd never flown a combat mission debated the necessity of expenditures. Paperwork disappeared into files and was forgotten. Meanwhile, men kept freezing. Wind blast was the single largest cause of high-altitude frostbite, responsible for 39% of all cases in the 14-month period ending December 1943. By 1944, that proportion had risen to nearly 55%. The problem was simple physics. Air moving at 200 miles per hour strips heat from the human body faster than any heating system can replace it. Even a perfectly functioning heated suit couldn't overcome that heat loss when a waist gunner was leaning into the slipstream tracking an attacking fighter. Clearing jammed guns created another deadly problem. A .50 caliber machine gun could jam at any moment during combat. The gunner had to clear the jam or his weapon was useless. Clearing the jam meant working with the weapon's charging handle, a metal lever that had to be gripped firmly and pulled hard. Training manuals said this could be done while wearing the heavy leather flight gloves issued to crews. The training manuals were wrong. The gloves were too bulky for precise manipulation. They'd been designed for warmth, not dexterity. A man wearing them could grip a gun handle and press a trigger, but he couldn't work the fine mechanisms needed to clear a malfunction. Gunners across the 8th Air Force discovered this in combat. When their guns jammed and enemy fighters were attacking, they had seconds to get their weapons working again. They did what they had to do, They pulled off their gloves. They gripped frozen metal with bare fingers. They cleared the jams. They saved their aircraft and their crewmates. And they lost fingers. The flesh froze on contact with metal that had been chilled to minus 60 degrees. 15 seconds of exposure was enough to cause permanent damage. 30 seconds could mean amputation. Casualty reports noted that these men had violated proper procedure by removing their gloves. Regulations clearly stated that gun malfunctions should be cleared with gloves on. The bureaucracy blamed the men. But the regulations didn't work. Everyone knew they didn't work. Everyone who'd actually flown combat knew that the choice was between losing fingers and losing your aircraft. The men did what they had to do because the alternative was dying. Ground crews watched their bombers return from missions with injured men aboard. They saw frostbite casualties carried off to ambulances. They heard the stories in mess halls and barracks. They knew something was terribly wrong. Master Sergeant Earl Southwick was a crew chief with the 398th Bomb Group, 603rd Squadron. His job was keeping his assigned B-17 flying no matter what condition it returned in, no matter what damage the Germans had done, no matter what systems had failed. Southwick worked long days in the cold and rain of an English winter. He patched battle damage with sheet metal and rivets. He replaced engines that had been shot out over Germany. He fixed hydraulic lines and electrical systems and oxygen regulators and 1,000 other components that could fail under the stress of combat. He understood the difference between official specifications and operational reality. Specifications said certain repairs required depot-level maintenance, meaning the aircraft had to be taken out of service and sent to a rear area facility. Specifications said certain modifications needed engineering approval from the manufacturer, meaning paperwork that would take weeks or months to process. But depot-level maintenance meant an aircraft was unavailable for combat for extended periods. Engineering approval meant paperwork that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes and never returned. The 8th Air Force needed every bomber it could put in the air. There was no time for proper channels. Southwick's assistant, Dallas, later wrote about those days. Had this kind of repair been made stateside, he said, he could have been court-martialed. But this was a different time and place. We had to do what had to be done to keep the planes in the air. The three-man ground crew of Southwick, E.B. Best and Fred Whitman maintained their B-17, so well that not one of their aircraft ever turned back from a mission because of mechanical problems. Southwick received the Bronze Star for this achievement. Ground crews improvised throughout the theater. They fabricated parts that weren't available through supply channels. They performed repairs that regulations said only depot facilities could attempt. They modified aircraft to solve problems the original designers had never anticipated. The same spirit of improvisation drove efforts to address frostbite at the squadron level. Mechanics experimented with additional insulation for gun positions. They rigged extra electrical outlets for heated equipment. They wrapped heating elements in protective coverings to reduce wire breakage. But field expedients couldn't overcome systemic failure. The heating suits were designed wrong. The waste gun windows were open to the slipstream. The entire concept of operating in extreme cold had been inadequately considered. Individual initiative couldn't overcome systemic failure. The 8th Air Force needed solutions that came from the top down, developed by engineers and implemented across the entire force. Colonel Grow understood that the frostbite crisis required systematic response. Individual courage and improvisation couldn't overcome flawed equipment and inadequate training. The Army Air Forces needed new solutions developed by experts and deployed at scale. He began working on multiple fronts simultaneously. Better suits that wouldn't fail, better training so crews understood the dangers, better protective equipment to address specific vulnerabilities, modified aircraft designs that would reduce crew exposure to the killing cold. The heated suit problem was the most urgent. Gross investigation had identified the core flaw in the F-1 design. Wiring the heating elements in series meant that a single break anywhere in the circuit killed the entire suit. The solution was obvious to anyone who understood basic electrical engineering. wire the elements in parallel. In a parallel circuit, each heating element operates independently. Electric current flows through multiple paths simultaneously. If one wire breaks, current simply flows through the remaining paths. A man might lose heat to one part of his body, but he wouldn't lose heat everywhere at once. The parallel design also allowed for redundancy. If the suit had two independent circuits, a break in one would still leave 50% of the heating capacity functional. A man with half his suit working could survive much longer than a man with no heat at all. Grow pushed the requirements through the procurement system. General Electric developed a new suit based on the parallel wiring principle. The F-2 electrically heated flying suit was standardized in August 1943. The new suit was fundamentally different from the Blue Bunny. Instead of one-piece coverall, it consisted of four main pieces: an electrically heated jacket, electrically heated trousers, an unheated outer jacket, and unheated outer trousers. The modular design allowed crews to replace individual components if one piece failed rather than discarding an entire suit. The heating elements used more flexible wiring that resisted breakage. The connections between components were more robust. And critically, the wiring was connected in parallel rather than series. Without electrical current, the F-2 suit was comfortable down to 32 degrees Fahrenheit. With current flowing through the heating elements, it could maintain comfort at minus 30 degrees. The suit also included connections for heated goggles and oxygen mask heaters, addressing other cold-related problems that had emerged during operations. The F-2A variant added thermostats in February 1944, allowing crews to control the heat level instead of running at full power constantly. Crews had complained that original heating suits ran too hot in some conditions, causing sweating that then led to chill when the moisture froze. The thermostatic control solved this problem. The F-3 suit, introduced in spring 1944, extended the comfort range to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. It improved the electrical controls and fittings and enhanced the parallel wiring system so that even with multiple failures, the suit would continue providing some heat. But developing new suits was only part of the solution. Manufacturing them took time. Distributing them across the theater took more time. Training crews in their proper use took still more time. While improved equipment worked its way through the supply chain, men continued freezing in the skies over Germany. The second major improvement addressed the wind blast problem. Gross investigation had documented that wind blast through the open waist gun windows was the single largest cause of frostbite. Waist gunners were suffering because they stood at open windows exposed to 200-mile-per-hour Arctic wind. Wind chill at those speeds and temperatures was beyond anything the human body could endure for extended periods. No heating suit could compensate for that kind of exposure. No amount of insulated clothing could prevent frostbite when Arctic wind was blasting directly on exposed skin. The only real solution was to block the wind. The B-17G model began production in July 1943, following its first flight in May. The new variant entered combat service with the 8th Air Force in fall of that year. The G model featured enclosed waist gun windows. The guns mounted through openings in plexiglass panels that blocked the wind while still allowing the weapons to traverse and track targets. The new windows dramatically reduced frostbite among waist gunners. Men who'd been losing fingers to wind blast exposure could now operate their weapons in relative comfort. The cold was still present, but it was manageable cold, the kind that heated suits and insulated clothing could handle. The G model also staggered the waist gun positions, placing the left gunner slightly forward of the right gunner. This gave both men more room to move without bumping into each other, reducing the tangling of oxygen lines and heated suit cables that had contributed to equipment failures. Colonel Grow pushed for additional innovations beyond suits and windows. He studied the casualty reports and identified specific failure modes causing injuries. For each problem, he developed a targeted solution. He designed warm, light, flexible gloves that didn't have to be removed to clear jam guns. The new gloves used thinner, more flexible materials that allowed precise finger movements while still providing insulation. Crews were trained that their hands would be frostbitten if they removed their gloves, and it was demonstrated that jammed guns could usually be cleared just as readily with gloved hands as with bare hands if the gloves were properly designed. He created warm and fire-resistant face and neck protectors to address the frostbite injuries that had shifted to these areas as hand injuries declined. He designed electrically heated blankets for wounded men whose heated suits had to be cut away to treat injuries. If the heat system of an aircraft was destroyed by enemy action, or if a wounded man's suit had to be removed, these blankets could provide warmth during the flight home. In July 1943, Grow received the Legion of Merit for developing body armor to protect combat crews. His analysis of wound reports had shown that nearly 70% of combat wounds were caused by low-velocity missiles, primarily shrapnel from anti-aircraft shells that had fragmented nearby. He designed light body armor made of overlapping steel plates that could stop these low-velocity fragments. The armor saved many lives and improved morale. In May 1944, Grow was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his comprehensive work on crew protection. The citation specifically mentioned his device to protect gunners from wind blast, his electrically heated clothing and gloves and boots and hand warmers, his casualty bags for wounded, and his wind and fire-resistant face and neck protectors. The recognition came because the solutions were working. Frostbite cases had decreased. Flight efficiency had increased. Crews were surviving missions they would have lost to the cold just months earlier. The statistics told the story of transformation. In early 1943, cold injuries exceeded combat wounds as a cause of crew losses. By late 1943 and into 1944, the proportions had reversed. The lessons learned in the frozen skies over Germany shaped military aviation for generations afterward. When the Boeing B-29 Superfortress entered service against Japan in 1944, it featured fully pressurized crew compartments. The crew didn't need electrically heated suits because the cabin maintained survivable temperatures at altitude. The gun turrets were remotely controlled from inside the pressurized cabin, eliminating the need for gunners to sit exposed in the slipstream. The B-29 represented a fundamentally different approach to high-altitude combat. Instead of trying to protect humans against an inhospitable environment, it eliminated their exposure to that environment entirely. The crew flew in shirt-sleeve comfort while their aircraft operated at altitudes that would freeze an unprotected man in minutes. This design philosophy persisted into the jet age and beyond. Modern military aircraft feature pressurized, climate-controlled cockpits. Fighter pilots wear flight suits designed primarily for G-force protection and emergency ejection, not for survival in Arctic temperatures. The hard lessons of 1943 and 1944 had taught aircraft designers a fundamental truth. Human beings cannot reliably survive extreme cold, no matter how much protective equipment they wear. Better to engineer the cold out of the equation entirely. Colonel Malcolm Grow continued his distinguished career after the war. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, the new Air Force Medical Service needed leadership from someone who understood both aviation and combat medicine. On July 1, 1949, Malcolm Grow became the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force. He'd helped create the service he now led. His work on crew protection during the war had saved countless lives and established principles that still guide aerospace medicine. Grow retired from the Air Force on December 1, 1949, after more than 31 years in uniform. He died on October 20, 1960, at age 72 at the Air Force Hospital at Andrews Air Force Base. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. 2 years later, the Malcolm Grow Medical Center at Joint Base Andrews was named in his honor, a permanent reminder of his contributions to military medicine. The men who froze in the skies over Germany are gone now. The waist gunners and ball turret operators who endured -50-degree cold for hours while fighting for their lives. The tail gunners and radio operators who suffered frostbite despite wearing every piece of protective gear the Army could provide. Their generation has passed into history. But the experience of those frozen airmen shaped the world they left behind. Every pressurized cockpit, every climate-controlled crew station, every piece of cold-weather protective equipment used by modern aviators. All of it traces back to the failures and solutions of 1943. The frostbite epidemic was a preventable tragedy that became a forcing function for innovation. Men suffered and died because equipment was inadequate. Their suffering drove the development of equipment that was adequate. The men of the 8th Air Force bought that safety with their suffering. The waist gunners with their frozen hands, the ball turret operators with their dead heating suits, the tail gunners with their frostbitten ears. They were test subjects in an experiment they never agreed to participate in. They discovered the limits of human endurance at minus 60 degrees. They paid the price so that no one would have to pay it again. We should not forget what they endured.